Good evening, everyone. Erev Tov. It's wonderful to see you here. And thank you all for braving the elements and coming out tonight. You know, coming back to Tuesday Night Learning is a significant step for our community, for our congregation. When the pandemic hit, this being one of the cornerstone projects of our synagogue, we say, you know, no matter what happens, no matter what we cancel in person, online, we have to make sure that Tuesday Night Learning continues. And so we continued online for quite a while, and then in the second year of the pandemic, we evolved to be a little bit of a hybrid model, some in person, some online, and now here we are back in person and regrowing and rebuilding, and we are so excited to have Tuesday Night Learning back at the Shaar. Please note, though, because this is a new world, there is still a virtual component, and these sessions will be made available to the entire congregation at the conclusion of the series. So you're getting the authentic experience here in person, post-pandemic, and experiencing the warmth and the connections that certainly is part of Tuesday Night Learning and part of Shaar Hashomayim. But all of these, the teachings and our guests and their presentations will be made available online. Of course, as we continue the tradition of Tuesday Night Learning, there are innovations and changes. And one of the great innovations and the great next steps of Tuesday Night Learning is that we are delighted to welcome a new chair of Tuesday Night Learning, Ina Nekem, who is a member of our Shaar Hashomayim Board of Trustees and has stepped forward as a very significant leader in our congregation and in making this happen together with Robin Bennett, to whom we are so grateful, and the entire Shaar team for producing wonderful and high-level programs, Tuesday Night Learning, of course, being no exception. So I'm now going to invite Ina to come forward to introduce our distinguished guests this evening. Thank you very much. Erev Tov.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome. Thank you all for being here. As Rabbi said, braving the elements. After a wonderful summer we had, it does seem a bit of a extra challenge this evening. My name is Ina Nekem. I'm the new chair. I have the difficult task of following Louis Dobrin, who's been chairing Tuesday Night Learning for 20 years. But I will do what I can, and he certainly will be an inspiration and a challenge that I'm happy to take on. He has a stellar lineup of speakers, but I'm sure that starting with tonight, we will do him proud and the Shaar as well. Our presentation tonight deals with the topic of the Holocaust, as you could tell, but it takes it in a different direction. It takes it east, as there's been a lot written, of course, about the history, and every story that's written adds something to our knowledge about the Holocaust. But there's been significantly less written about the stories of the Jews, Polish Jews, and not only Polish ones, who went east towards the Soviet Union and the other republics, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and ultimately to Iran, and some of the lucky ones to Israel afterwards. So this was the direction east, was taken by Professor Dekel's father, together with about 250,000 of other Polish Jews. And kind of mystified and inspired by her father's story, Professor Dekel decided to take on the challenge and explore, first as a personal story, his travels to Iran, and ultimately came out with this book because of so much wonderful research and extremely difficult research conducted in never before seen by the outsider's eye files in Russia and Poland and in Iran. So we welcome Professor Dekel. Thank you so much. We're excited to learn about this story. And so this is the book. It's called East, In the East, How My Father and 250,000 Jews Survived the Holocaust. Interviewing Professor Dekel tonight is met Adam Atlas, who is a legal counsel to the Holocaust Museum of Montreal, attorney by trade, himself a child of a hidden survivor, and supremely qualified for this job tonight that he's so graciously accepted. And his focus in reading, in personal reading, is the Holocaust literature, but also he trained, just as a journalist for the CBC. So we're in for a treat, and I will not hold you up much longer. We will start with this interview, and Professor Dekel's book will be available for sale after the talk, and if you wish, I'm sure she'll be more than happy to sign a copy for you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ina. Welcome, Professor Dekel.
Thank you.
So my three children graduated from Akiva School right next door under Rabbi Shaar's guidance in part. And in school, children learned that a object of a given size can have different weights. A piece of balsa wood weighs one thing and a piece of metal weighs another. This book weighs much more than what it appears, and it would be very interesting to get into the different layers of the books, and in some ways the many books that are inside this single book. I'm wondering if you'd like to bring us into this piece by telling us a bit about the story of your father, where he came from, and how it is that he went on this harrowing journey of survival.
Thank you, Adam, for agreeing to interview me, and thank you, Ina, for inviting me. Thank you all for coming here. I was telling Ina in my other hat, as I also direct a humanities center in New York, and it's been such a challenge to bring people back in person because everybody's used to being home. So I'm grateful that you're here. I'm grateful to be here. So my father, just to give you a little bit of background over how I started on this project, because I'm not a historian, I'm an English professor, but I wrote a history book that most historians today accept as a history book. My father was, I was born and raised in Israel, and my father in Israel was one of a group of children called Yaldei Tehran, or Tehran children. And these are about roughly 1,000 children, Holocaust survivors, who came to what was then mandatory Palestine through Tehran. And this is pretty much what I knew growing up. I didn't really even think about my father as a Holocaust survivor. I thought about him simply as a Tehran child. In fact, I thought about him as the opposite of Holocaust survivor, because Tehran children were exactly the ones who kind of didn't go through the real Holocaust, right? And so in 2007, a colleague of mine who's Persian, an Iranian-American author, in a party said to me, hey, do you know anything about Holocaust survivors who are in Iran? And I said, well, you know, as it happens, that was my father. And he said, but how did they get there? And I said, I have no idea exactly how they get there. So hence started a 10-year project during which I also traveled a lot of the routes that they took, except I didn't go to Iran because I'm Israeli and I was in the army, and that didn't seem like a good idea. And it still is not a good idea. But I had people researched for me in Iran. And so at the end of which I wrote a book that is actually the story of most Polish Jewish survivors, astonishingly. So it wasn't just my father, it wasn't just these more or less 1,000 Jewish kids, it was 250,000 Polish Jews who survived in the East, meaning mostly in the Central Asian republics of Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Turkmenistan, some in Iran, some in India, some who remained in what was the Russian interior, based in Siberia and the Komi Republic, kind of away from the urban centers. And so we know, and we can talk maybe about why this story hasn't really been more widely known and written about. The story of my father, and this is a very generic story. I was just talking to somebody in the audience. And basically what happens, and I'll show you a map. And this is, by the way, this is my father. This is 1938. This is my father, my aunt, his sister, younger sister, and their parents behind them. So 1939, the war starts. And very quickly, Poland gets divided between the German-controlled side and the Russian-controlled, the Soviet-controlled side. We all know that. At late 1939, out of 3.5 million Polish Jews, about 1.5 million end up on the Soviet side. Whether they fled there, like my family, because as you can imagine, also, people don't exactly know what to do. They don't know in 1939 what will happen. They don't know that the Germans are worse than the Soviets. Many of them think in 1939 that the Soviets are worse than the Germans, and they prefer to stay on the German side. But 1.5 million end up there. Of those people, about a third of them get deported to gulags, settlements, labor camps, all over the Soviet interior. In the case of my father's family, they get deported. They flee to the Soviet side. They're in the Bialystok area, and then they get deported to Arkhangelsk, which is all the way to the north, and that's where they are in a labor camp. After about 14 months, they're released from the labor camp through, anyway, politics. They continue on to a kind of second exile to Kazakhstan and then Uzbekistan. From there, just the children are evacuated through the Caspian Sea into Iran. So they're evacuated out of the Soviet Union into Iran, and eventually through the Persian Gulf, as you can see, to Karachi, through the Arabian Sea. And this is a very, very dangerous journey because all this is full of German sea mines, through the Suez Canal into Egypt and into Palestine, where they are, I'm trying to look for the, well, never mind, where they're received very, very, this is a kind of big moment for the Jewish population in Palestine. They arrived there in 1943, in February 1943, and this is the first group of survivors who arrive in the middle of the war, a group of children arriving, and it's a very big deal for the small Jewish population in Palestine at the time. So this is the very abbreviated version of my father's story, but it's also a story that is full of arbitrariness. So, at any given point, they could have had another fate. And so I kind of follow them from point A to point B to point C and look at the different fates that were available to them at the time.
And this is a story that you have cobbled together. Your father didn't give you his testimony in any particular detail, right?
No, and nothing. My father didn't speak at all. And it's not only, and I think, and none of these people spoke. I mean, they spoke very little. And one of the reasons why they didn't speak, as I now think, is that because in order to speak, you have to have the conditions for speaking. So, for example, today, I mean, if your parent was God forbid, survived Auschwitz, if you discover suddenly that your parents survived Auschwitz, you know what Auschwitz means. You already read Primo Levi. You already read Art Spiegelman. You already read Elie Wiesel. So you know what it means. But if you discover that your parent was in Kazakhstan, what does that even mean? And one of the things that happened after I wrote my book, people started writing me from all over, and people would say, oh my God, my grandmother said that she was standing in bread line in Alma-Ata or in Tashkent, and this happened and that happened, and we thought she made it up because there was no story. There was no framework to tell the story. And so people didn't tell it. And I think one of the things that my book did, inadvertently really, is it became the framework. And now, in fact, a lot of other people are working on these stories as well, including all kinds of famous people.
Coming from a son of a hidden child and having grown up in a small clutch of survivors here in Montreal, and Montreal has quite a large survivor community, or did, we would learn of people who had survived in the East, and my ignorant, if you will, conception of that was that, oh, well, they really had it easy. But reading this story, that's not at all the case. This was survival, but only survival. Take us in a bit to the harshness. There's probably a whole chapter on the various undulations of starvation that these people went through. Tell us about the East, because I don't think we know about it.
I mean, I think that is very much the conception that it wasn't the easy fate. And yes, it is easier than being in a death camp and being in a in gas chamber, but it's only easier compared to that. It's first of all, we have to remember that in the Stalinist era, even before 1939, there was already massive starvation in these areas. For example, in Uzbekistan, I mean, Stalin already had policies starting in the 1920s and 30s where all the crops basically were being taken away, and instead he was making the Uzbeks grow cotton. So already there was lack of food, and then on top of that, a war, on top of that, refugees. So there's tremendous hunger. Then there is, the life of escape, right? You become a refugee. You escape, you don't know what will happen. You escape into a kind of jungle. And there are a lot of layers in this. So this is not just a Jewish story, right? At least not only a Jewish story. So because there are a lot of people who are being deported. I mean, Stalin deported millions of people. But within all of this, you're also a Jew. So you're also at the bottom of the ladder within this kind of bigger scope of misery. Because if you're an Uzbek and you have no food, you've lived there for a long time, you know that you climb on this tree and you can get some fruit, but if you're a refugee, you can't. So hunger is a huge part of it. And labor, of course, gulags and labor. And the Soviets say that 250,000 people died in the gulags, according to Soviet counts. So we know that that's conservative. And there are a lot of horrible, horrible accounts that are out there. And then eventually, in the case of the children, the separation of children from parents, which ends up being separation for years and years and years. And many of these children don't see their parents again because their parents died, or at least one parent died, like my grandfather died. So yes, this is a very hard story, but even within this story, there are a lot of different faiths available.
So you came to learn this history and put this book together, and if you've read it or when you read this book, you'll see it is not just a history of the Jews escaping to the East. It is not just a biography of your father. It is not just a travel log, because to complete this book, Professor Dekel went physically along the path that we see here, I think with the exception of Iran. And it's not just a kind of psychological exploration of being a survivor and then a child of a survivor. It's all of those in one. And I want to learn from you how you decided to write this book in this way, because so many other books are only one of those. This is 4 books in one. Why did you write 4 books in one? Why didn't you just write a straight up history of the Jews to the East? Why did you put it all together? Masterfully, I must say.
Thank you. That's a great question, right? I should say that, I started writing this book. I got a contract. I sent a chapter to Norton, which is the publisher that I wanted. They got it. They said, look, this is very nice, but we don't care about you. We want to hear the story of what happened to these people, because we don't know the story. Don't write in first person. Don't write about yourself. Don't write about your journey. And I really wanted the contract with Norton, so I said, okay. And I revised the first chapter. I sent to them, and then the editor came back to me and said, you were right. It is so boring. but I do think that, I mean, of course, when you write, a lot of it is unconscious, but I do think that, I think it's actually important to write in this way because, this history happened 7 decades ago, almost 8 decades ago. It's not that you're going to some well and grabbing this history and bringing it up as like this pure thing from 8 decades ago. It's processed through your consciousness. It's processed through 8 decades of memory politics in these places. So it's not that you can just go to Russia and find out what happened because the Russians remember it in a different way. The archival material is not really accessible. The people, even the survivors themselves, tell you different stories. So I wanted to describe the process not only of what happened, but also of how hard it is to tell it and the different versions that are sometimes available of each story. And so I didn't want to hide that. I wanted to put that out there. And sometimes, as you could see, sometimes actually I don't know exactly what happened. And I say, this one says this one, the Soviets say this, the Poles say this. One of the difficulties with this story was that the Soviets, there is no footage from gulags. There are a handful of photos. There's hardly any footage from this period from the Soviet Union. So the Nazis exterminated, but also documented heavily everything. In my father's hometown, there was, which is Ostro-Mazowiecka, it's the town in Poland between Warsaw and Białystok. There was one of the first mass massacres of Jews. It was already in November 1939. They documented everything. I mean, both Polish bystanders and the people who did the actual murder. They documented people walking to their place of execution. They documented people being executed. The Soviets, if somebody wants to do a documentary film about a gulag today, they don't have any material. They have to do, they have to do illustrations and so on. This is a photo of people being deported to gulags. One of the only photos. This is, again, one of the only photos, completely generic, right, uninteresting. These are photos from that the Nazis took and Polish bystanders took of people walking basically to their place of execution. So, so it's very, very difficult to, yeah.
Do you feel, in reading it, I didn't feel that you had shortchanged the piece as a historical work. But do you feel that you shortchanged some of the history, or that you would have liked to tell more of your own personal connection to this history? Were you torn in these telling?
I think it's just right. I mean, my editor at Norton, I mean, this went through, I can't even tell you how many drafts. And my editor actually made me shorten some of the personal stuff. And people are very curious. People always ask me, like, they really want to know, like, what happened between you and like the Iranian guy or whatever, or what happened to you in Russia. But I didn't, it's true that I didn't want myself to dominate the story, because it's also the case that, and you and I talked about this, a lot of second generation memoirs are about the second generation, our trauma, our inherited trauma, and I strongly feel like that's enough with that. I feel like, and I have arguments with some of my friends, because in English departments, people are very focused on what cannot be known, right? What cannot be known about the trace, and I always say, it actually a lot can be known. It's just that it's really hard to know. You have to spend 10 years. You have to work very hard. But I think especially now, as when a lot of the survivors are dying off, and it's been many years, it's our duty to know. And at the same time, we cannot take ourselves out of it. So that's why I wrote the way I did.
Let's change gears. Poland then and now. So life for your family and mine in Poland before the war had its complications. During the war, unspeakable complications. And then now returning to Poland, as you did, we face this competing narratives about the history of what happened in Poland during the war. There are prominent Holocaust historians like Jan Gross and Jan Grabowski, a Canadian professor, University of Ottawa, who've written accounts of Polish involvement in the killing of Jews during the war and have faced sanctions by the Polish state. You managed to navigate around that issue, almost sort of putting it on the wall and letting the reader decide. Tell me what you think about Poland then and now, and as Polish people with Polish roots, and my mom speaks Polish, and growing up I heard a lot of Polish. They had mixed feelings about Poland, the country of their birth, and the culture, the food. And yet then there's this dark cloud hanging over the whole thing. Tell us about how you come to that.
Yeah, I actually feel, since I wrote the book, I've become more disillusioned with Poland, I guess. When I was writing the book, I was really trying to keep an open mind as much as I could. In part because, again, I grew up in Israel. I grew up very much with this narrative of, Poles worse than the Germans, kind of. I mean, so even though at the same time there was no explicit Polish hatred, but there was, I grew up with a kind of phobic of Poland, I feel like, in some way. And I never went there before I wrote this book, and I didn't want to go there. And in my mind, it was like this mythical place from where my father, thank God, escaped and never has to go back. And then I went back. I went because I started researching the book, or as I was researching the book, and I was like, wow, it's a place, it has like great restaurants, and Warsaw is very cool, and people live there, and I had hosts, and their kids played with Legos, the same Lego sets that my son played, and I was like, wow, it's a normal place, it's not a mythical place. And I actually became very interested, and one of the things that happened was that I went there once, and then I got an invitation to come back by a person who then ended up being the deputy minister of culture of the current Polish government, the current sort of national conservative Polish government. And she invited me, and she invited me with and said, well, her father was from the same town as my mother. And she wrote me, I invite you, my aunt saved Jews, and we invite you to this ceremony. And I was like, what? I never heard of anybody in this town saving Jews. And I was very skeptical, but I was also kind of open-minded. And I wanted to hear more. So I came there, and she was my host. And I inadvertently, I ended up in the company of, I guess, the people that we consider bad guys today, or at least not necessarily bad guys, but people who are basically, from our perspective, are engaging in what Jan Grabowski and Jan Gross called Holocaust revisionism. And I was very, I always say Israelis have the one advantage, it's their ignorance, right? We're like, yeah, why not? Sure, we'll come to dinner with, and hear what you have to say. And I was very actually interested. So it was the first time I heard of what happened to Catholic Poles during the war. Because, my focus was very kind of Jewish centered. And I really developed an appreciation and empathy, really, of what happened to them at the same time that I was conflicted with, because of course, many people were both victims and perpetrators, and that's what's complicated here. Having said that, eventually, and especially now, Holocaust revisionism has become so extreme in Poland, in the sense that the Polish government is basically devoting millions of dollars to telling a new story about the Holocaust, and that story is Polish Polish Catholics were almost as much victims as Jews, or maybe not as much, but victims of the Nazis, and they were not perpetrators, and they're not responsible. In fact, I don't know if people read, but just a week ago, Poland demanded something, whatever trillion million dollars from Germany for the Jews it lost, right? And you sit there and you're like, God, the chutzpah, right? And so I've become more, it's very hard to empathize with that. And so since I happened to have this very intimate look at these people, Jan Grabowski came to me and said, you should really write about your interactions with Magda Gawin and with these Polish nationalists, and you should publish something about it. And I was very conflicted because I felt like I'm going to betray. They were my hosts. They helped me. And how am I going to write that? But on the other hand, then I decided, no, it's really, as an academic, my duty is to the truth more than to any person. And I'm going to write the truth and as much as I can. So I ended up publishing. This is the article. I published an article in Poland in Gazeta Wyborcza. It's like the New York Times of Poland. And they published it on the front page. And it was about my family. And it's something about, it's something like my father's Jewish family and the Polish, and the deputy minister of culture's father came from the same town. This is what happened, or something like that. And so I published this, and I got a lot of hate mail, but also I got a lot of beautiful emails especially from young people in Poland, and a lot of people wrote me beautiful, including from my father's hometown. People wrote me, it's the first time I understood what the issue is, because I did try to write it in a way that says, look, as a Jew, we don't want to think that we're the only ones who suffered. I mean, I don't want to claim exclusivity in suffering. On the contrary, right? I mean, it's a horrible fate to feel like it's only you. But that doesn't mean that, what they're doing is right. And I try to navigate that. So now I'm not on a good terms with those people at all. I think I can still go to Poland, but I don't think I'll be really welcomed.
Well, sometimes bringing out the truth, sometimes there's a price to bringing out the truth.
I think it's important, especially if you're a tenured professor. I mean, I was actually really scared because I got a lot of hateful messages on Twitter, but I have an 18-year-old son, and he kept telling me, like, yeah, everybody gets hate mail on Twitter. Don't worry about it. They're not going to do anything to you. It's just messages. And I was like, okay.
Not to stay in the Polish scene for longer than we should, but there was an interesting moment you speak about in the book where you were having dinner with this macharim of the Polish historical and cultural scene, and you comment that these Poles you were meeting had not deconstructed the Polish national idea in the way that maybe we have in a kind of postmodern way in the West. But they cherished it wholeheartedly, their nationalism. And then you go on to compare that Polish nationalism of today to the Israeli nationalism that you grew up with and that you see today in Israel. Tell us about those similarities, because instinctually, and this could be just because of my bias, I was like, well, that can't be true. I mean, the Polish nationalism today is somehow tied to historical revisionism, perhaps. And could that possibly be true of Israel? I would never imagine so, as a Zionist, etc. So tell me how you came to make that comparison.
I mean, first of all, you were talking about your mother, and I do think that Jews in Poland, especially my family was very, my family, one of the things that shocked me, it had been in the same Polish town for 8 generations. We were in Israel for 1 generation. I'm already here. 8 generations. They were one of the oldest families in this town, and they were very prominent. And people, when I actually went to this town, people told me today, they were like, "Oh, you're Titel's granddaughter," and so on. So they were very intertwined, and the Polish nationalism of the interwar period. I mean, I think Zionism people like Jabotinsky and so on were they fed off Polish nationalist thinking and vice versa. So first of all, historically, they're connected. One of the interesting things about these Polish nationalists today is that they're very pro-Israel. And one of the reasons why they invited me and they accepted me is because they didn't see me as a kind of liberal New York Jewish academic. They hate those people, pro-abortion and so. But they saw me as an Israeli, and they would say, they're like, "You were in the army, great," and I would say to them, "Oh, yeah, I feel so bad about my father." They would say, "But he was a hero. He fought in '48." So these notions of heroism and army, I actually think, from what I heard, the Israeli army also trains the Polish army today, or a lot of it. So it's one of those crazy things. So I did see, and again, at the time I saw some, because they're just the way they're talking about the Polish nation, I feel like I grew up with that in the 1970s in Israel, where it was a lot more naive, and we'd have all these ceremonies. It's a lot less so now. They constantly use those analogies themselves. I mean, there's a museum in Warsaw called the Warsaw Uprising Museum, not the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, the Warsaw Uprising Museum. And a lot of serious historians think that's a very fake museum, in the sense that it's kind of Disneyfied version of history again, of, we rose against the Soviets and the Germans and so on. When I was there, I got a tour from the deputy director, and he said to me, and he took me to his office, and he had a picture of himself and Shimon Peres on the wall, and he said, you an Israeli, you understand this museum. Germans, they come here, they hate this museum, they don't understand it, because the Germans think of it themselves as post-history. But for you Israelis and for us Poles, history has just begun. And I now think retroactively, it's a very problematic thing that he said, but at the same time, I knew where he was coming from. But, again, I was in Poland in 2014, and things have gotten much worse since then. I think much, much worse in terms of Polish nationalism and in this government. And I should say, when I say Polish nationalism, I'm talking about the government and the people that support it. I mean, there's resistance to it too, and they're like wonderful, wonderful people in Poland, local historians who are fighting this narrative and who are actually risking a lot more than I do, because I'm like, after all, live here and I'm in America and I'm tenured, but these people are actually losing jobs and so on because they're resisting this. So.
Thank you for that view from the street of where so many of us come from. Okay, let's turn the page to the second generation that you represent. There's all kinds of, it's kind of a la mode now to be of a suffering lineage. Epigenetics, intergenerational trauma is bizarrely but factually common or popular now. How do you see our role as the second generation, and how have you reconciled yourself to that position?
I mean, first of all, I do believe in that. I do believe that we are inheritors of that, and I don't believe that I'm very uncynical about it. I think, what can you do? I mean, the fact is that we come from a people who went through genocide, and we're not that far removed from it, and we're affected by it. So that's the first thing. And I say that as somebody who grew up in Israel, where, and when I was growing, it was shameful to be a victim, right? In the 70s and 80s, and you wanted to be strong, and I rejected the notion of suffering and so on. But now I think that's just silly, because you can't. It's just who you are, and that's it, and you can't. Having said that, what is your duty? And I mean, people take different views. I mean, like I said, I mean, obviously, I took this as my duty to write this, and so on. But I think in terms of this mode of that, it's fashionable to be a victim or survivor and so on. I think it's very easy to become cynical about that, right? And also that there's a kind of competition and people are like, oh, I suffered more than you. And I get that. I teach in a primarily, in a school that is primarily minority students. And it's very easy to fall into those narratives where people are like, I suffered more. You have no right to talk about this because of that. And I really believe we have to reject that because it's just a terrible thing. I mean, there's enough room for people suffering. Having said that, of course, sometimes, I mean, if you look at the Palestinians and Israelis, or if you look at, in a way, Poles and Jews, sometimes there's a real conflict over that. But overall, I think it's a good thing because there is room for people to embrace that past, rather than deny it. Where for many survivors, I mean, if you read the accounts of Primo Levi, and they were told they couldn't even find publishers, right? Because the people didn't want to hear that. And now this is the same with this story. So, I mean, one of the questions that people always ask me about how come nobody wrote this story, and I tell them what I told you. People say, well, didn't people write memoirs? Because even if you don't have research, usually you have memoirs. And I said, people did write memoirs. And there's a tremendous memoir by somebody by the name of Julius Margolin, who is like the Elie Wiesel of this story, the Elie Wiesel of the Gulag. He wrote it immediately. He came to Israel in 1946. He started writing it right away. It was published in an unabridged version in English for the first time in 2021, last year, with a really nice edition. Oxford published it. Timothy Snyder, the historian Timothy Snyder, wrote an introduction and so on. Why didn't it get published? Because of a lot of reasons. Politics, right? Because the Russians were the victors of World War II and the saviors. So people didn't want to tell the story of like the bad things that happened under the Russian watch because of a lot of different. So in other words, if there is an opportunity for people to tell their stories and for second and third generation, I think it's a good thing.
Well, I'm grateful that you do. Well, we don't have a lot more time in this portion that we're going to soon turn to questions. It would have been nice to cover many other topics, such as Iran's role in the story, the Ukraine war right now. All of these things, I think you'd bring a lot of color to, and I think even just reading the book would give us more background on that. But I think it's just about time. Oh yeah? Okay. So I wonder if you could maybe give us a little bit on Iran and Ukraine from your perspective.
Yeah. I mean, in Iran, so as I said, these children, basically what happens is the Polish government in exile, which is in the Soviet Union, is evacuated to Iran. Iran is then under basically British control, British and Russian. And with it, these Jewish children, and mostly Polish Christian children, but some Jewish children are taken there. And in Iran, there are actually quite a lot of Jewish refugees. German Jewish refugees who came there in the 1930s, just with the rise of Hitler, mostly professional engineers, doctors. For Iran, Iran was a kind of modernizing country, and they saw these people as assets. So for them, a German Jewish engineer was the same as a German engineer. This is somebody who could build bridges and hospitals and so on. So you had a kind of Iran was a neutral country in 1939 with strong affiliation to Germany. And Iran then becomes this very schizophrenic place where there are German Jewish refugees, but there are also Nazis and Gestapo, and they're all there together, basically. And things could have turned out worse, but they didn't. And a lot of the testimonies from Iran are very positive, because Iran is basically the first place that actually has food. And on an individual level, people are very kind. People see these, for example, these children, they see them, they bring them candy, they start crying when they see them and something they look horrible. So that was Iran then. Iran today is, it's still a very schizophrenic country in a way because it has great population, but also not a great government leadership. And people in Iran mostly don't know the story. People in Iran today know this. They just say, "Oh, the Poles were there." We hosted the Poles. They don't realize that there are actually quite a few Polish Jews among the Poles, some of whom remain there. And that's another thing that's when you write a book like this, one of the shocking things is that when you think about an escape story, you always think of kind of an escape from point A to point B. But it's not like that. It's very arbitrary. It's like any other refugee story. So every transit point for my father was an end point to many people. And some of these people stayed in Iran, whether they married, like young women, young Polish Jewish women who married Persian men or Persian Jewish men or Persian Muslim men and remained there and they became Iranian. To me, it was one of the shocking, it's kind of a simple insight, but at the same time, you don't think about it. So I would just think, wow, that could have been me. Like I could have been like this Persian Mikal or this Uzbek Mikal or, and so on. And I did see these people and I did meet these people. So that was Iran. And we have to remember that following that, in a way, what happened was because these refugees were there, representatives from Palestine, from what's called like the Mossad, came to Iran to basically bring these children to what will become Israel. And one of the things that happened is that they start discovering the local population, making connections with the Shah at the time, and they remain there. And Israel and Iran actually become, until 79, Israel and Iran have very strong ties. In one of those very strange coincidences, it's Israeli engineers end up replacing the German engineers and end up building Iran. And some people say that Israel first started the Iranian nuclear program. I'm sorry to say.
Maybe that's your next book.
My next book, yeah. But it's very fascinating to see those arbitrary things that happen from refugee stories, where people come and other people come, and this happens and that happens. So that was Iran. And the Ukraine war, we will talk about it later.
Okay. Wow. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming to visit us in Montreal, for giving this wonderful talk, for marking our inaugural in-person only return to Tuesday night learning. Thank you, Adam, for doing the interview beautifully, for bringing out most interesting and sort of as many points as we could in the short time that we had. Please read the book if you can. It is available for purchase. Mikal will be happy to sign it for you if you are interested. What can I say? Thank you. I first heard about Mikal when I was reading my collection of Jewish news and in the context of Ukrainian war. And I thought that her view was so interesting. And that's how I got to the book, and I'm so happy that I did. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Thank you all for coming. And just briefly, I would like to tell you that we have more coming, more interesting talks coming. We have our next lecture is in October 25th, and it's with Alice Shapiro, and it's called Doctor on Call. She was the first responder in Chernobyl in 1986, and she was the physician who worked with the children coming out of that disaster, and she's now an expert in radiation and treatments. On November 1st, we have Israel Biton, and it's an interesting parallel with what Mikal had said. It's Who Will Remember You, sort of a study of memory and will, and there's a lot to be said about memory and how it affects what we write and what we remember, and so that should be an interesting lecture, which may remind us of this first one as well. On November 8th, we have Debbie Applegate, and she wrote a biography of Polly Adler, who was the madam in, I think, New York, and the icon of the jazz age. So that should be some exciting, juicy bits there. And on November 15th, we have Isabel Vincent, who will be in conversation with our very own Cantor Gideon Zellermeyer. And it's about the two sisters who saved the Jewish stars of the opera from the Third Reich. And so that's going to be something to sing about. And we hope to see you all there. Please tell your friends. Please tell your families. We hope to see more of you here in person. And thank you all for coming, and have a good night.
Thank you.